there was always kind of a mystery about why the White Album is the way it is after Pepper. Now we kind of understand it as them actually taking Pepper and even expanding that. It's actually even more epic. It's so far reaching. Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting that we really didn't wrap our heads around that. So we really got evidence, really got proof of it in this past anniversary phase of the White Album, where we started to see it as a real follow-up to Pepper, that they intended it that way and all this kind of stuff, whereas it felt like a reaction for so many years to Pepper, but it's actually not. It's expanding on it.
Mm-hmm. On that collage philosophy.
Totally. You can see the line. It's almost the first regression in a way is really Abbey Road, not White Album. I just don't know if people really got where they were coming from with the White Album until much, much, much later.
No, I think that when you've got this wonderfully contrived, I don't mean it in a negative way, but choreographed, if you like that word better, put together with Pepper, everything from the work that went into assembling that crowd of particular faces on the cover.
Yeah. Buttoned up,
Yeah, and the old Beatles alongside the new Beatles, and the lyrics on the back cover, and the gatefold, and all that stuff, all that presentation. And then you've got a 180 degree, it's all white. There's nothing on the outside except their name stamped on it and the individual number rolling off the press that you own this unique piece of art from the Beatles to you in 1968. So people might have been reacting like, oh, they're dialing it back for this record, instead of recognizing, no, it was a lot more subtle than that. What they were doing as far as an expansion of the palette went, and again, to speak to that sort of impressionistic collage approach, so many songs on the White Album are made up of just varying components or elements that aren't sort of obvious. Even John, it seems to be a Paul specialty to create these little mini suites of a song within a song. You were talking before about the sort of twists that Fixing a Hole undergoes arrangement-wise. At that moment, I was thinking about You Never Give Me Your Money, and how it segues out of college money spent into that one sweet dream, exhilarating uplift. And he just did that over and over and over again in his career. Uncle Albert, Band on a Run, whatever. And here's John doing it with Happiness is a Warm Gun. You've got these distinct segments that then pivot into something else. And if you need an encapsulation of that philosophy on the White Album, there it is in one song.
When you're just talking about the going from the Pepper cover to the stark white cover of White Album, that pivot, that surprise, that dichotomy is, and we were talking about this the other day, Luther, about how I think there is like a universe of depth in that moment, going from Within Without You to When I'm 64, that pivot, that transition, just the feeling that you get, if you're like really in it, if you're really listening and you've taken that trip of Within Without You, the way you feel When I'm 64 comes on is really
it's whiplash
interesting.
Too, and
it's super strange. It's super strange. It's
genius.
And
it's genius. Yeah.
And bridging it with the laughter.
It's
right.
And it's unsettling too. It's both exhilarating and unsettling at the same time.
Because they're committed so hard to each concept. I mean, they're not just doing this Indian thing with Within You Without You. It's really legit. It's really all the way, the commitment level, even Lennon talking, how excited he was about that track. And then the commitment level on When I'm 64. And by the way, how much that's meaningful to them as a band. That was their comic relief, intense moments on stage. Both things are after their own hearts.
Yeah, and deep for them in different ways,
Absolutely. It's therapeutic.
It's saying that this is tension between like, am I an entertainer or am I an artist? We've been the Beatles. 8 months ago or whatever, we were still singing rock and roll music, which is meaningful to us in its own way. But the idea that they had made Revolver, but they're still on stage singing rock and roll music is just
what Pat just said. What Pat just said, the fact they were singing rock and roll music, when you line it up right before they did Pepper, that still is such a disconnect in my head.
And after you've released Tomorrow Never Knows, I mean, that is just mind blowing. So this tension that they must have all been feeling, like, what are we? Are we artists? McCartney is like floating through London, going to John Cage and seeing experimental films and George is getting deep into his spiritual education. They must have felt this like really existential tension of what are we? I love watching, and we've seen it so many times, the footage of when they're arriving at Abbey Road.
Can I have a word? Are the Beatles going to go their own ways in 1967? They could be, on our own or together. We're always involved with each other, whatever we're doing.
Could you ever see a time when, in fact, you weren't working together?
I could see us working not together for a period, but we'd always get together for one reason or other. You need other people for ideas as well, but, and we all get along fine.
If you never toured again, would it worry you?
I don't know. No, I don't think so.
Wouldn't worry you?
But because the only thing about that, you see, is that performance for us, see, it's gone downhill, performance, because we can't develop when no one can hear us, you know what I mean? So for us to perform it's difficult, gets difficult each time.
You mean they don't listen to you, and therefore you don't want to do that?
Oh yeah, we want to do it, but if we're not listened to, then, and we can't even hear ourselves, then we can't improve in that. We can't get any better. So we're trying to get better with things like recording.
Robert, do you have any idea of what day that was, what they were working on when they arrived that day?
Yes, that was December 66. That was them coming in. I believe they were working on When I'm 64.
That's what I've heard, yeah.
Okay.
But it was after Strawberry Fields was in progress. They started that in November, and this was December. It was right before Christmas.
Right.
So it's an interesting little snapshot of them sort of between stages, still looking a little bit mop-toppy, but the facial hair is coming in, and in their heads, they've already moved on.
And just the presence that they all have, you really see so much.
Mm-hmm.
Like Paul is very serious. Like Paul's very intense in that.
Yeah.
And generous with his time.
And generous, but he's on a mission. He's like,
God.
Look, this is, if we can't be listened to,
right.
If we can't progress as musicians, then, we have to pivot. We have to do a new thing. So this is what we're doing now. You can tell he's like really in it. John.
He's generous too.
He is. And he's very soft in that moment too.
Probably high as hell.
It is interesting because Pepper is so laden with imagery.
Yeah.
Like well beyond anything they've done to that point.
Yeah.
And he, of course, just made this film. And at the time, they were talking about doing a Pepper TV special with some kind of film for each song. They only got as far as A Day in Life, and that was it.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh, wow.
And then they segued into Magical Mystery Tour as something completely different. But that was where their heads were at. It's like, if you're approaching it as a problem-solving thing, it's like, we don't want to go out on the road, but we realize we have to engage our fans. We need to have some kind of presence. So what can we do? I know, let's do something for TV.
You think Magical Mystery Tour was a realization of the concept they kind of had going during Pepper?
It sort of evolved. It was like they were not wanting to do another United Artists, Dick Lester kind of film. And that's when they got Joe Orton involved. You might know about that. He was that playwright in London that they'd actually gotten a script from him called Up Against It, which was so out there. It would have blown everybody's minds. And the Beatles turned it down because it was just not their thing. But that was the direction they were going in. They wanted to do something different. Instead, they did something that, if you look at Mystery Tour in its way as sort of an extension of Pepper, in that, again, you've got this sort of nostalgic vibe. You've got this, come on, everybody, including our parents' generation, we're going to do something you're familiar with, this mystery trip, which was a thing in England, where you'd buy a bus ticket not knowing where you were going, and it would be this fun little experience, sing-alongs on the bus and all that stuff. Only they added the layer of psychedelia to it so they can do Fool on the Hill and Flying and all this other stuff to it. So that was their sort of mashup of two different styles to present in their way something new that was visual, not tied to an album like Pepper was. I think by that time they'd kind of outgrown, well, Pepper is what it is. We don't need to lock these songs into a specific visual thing for all eternity. Instead, we'll do a film and then do songs to that or whatever.
Right. Thank goodness, because it just keeps it so mysterious. It keeps the magic
locked in. Yeah.
Keeps the magic alive. Keeps us, even though, like I say, I think there has been sort of this over the decades, this kind of associated with Pepper, with this kind of being the quintessential summer of love, and then you kind of attach it to all that stuff. But if you can listen to it disassociated from that and really just hear its own internal magic, separated from
the visual presentation
from that period, I think
sustains a lot of the power that it has as a listening experience. And this was true of every Beatles album. The sequencing. as Chris Thomas had said on this show, sometimes the difference between a good album and a great album is the order of the songs.
Absolutely.
With Pepper, it's almost an alternative universe thing where you've got things that are grounded in this world, but there's a magical element to them, a sort of surrealism to them, whether it be the circus with Mr. Kite, even She's Leaving Home. There's something about that it's not so stark as a For No One. Going to When I'm 64 and Isle of Wight imagery and the whole good morning thing where it's the starting point was the mundane day-to-day life, but it really takes some twists and turns, not least with the rhythmic shifts in that piece of music, which is amazing.
Oh, yeah. I was just listening to that again the other day and you guys are both drummers, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I mean,
it's absurd.
It's absurd. And so, and it's such a tough tune.
Well, like, what if Ringo couldn't do the shit that Lennon wanted him to do? I mean, you have to ask that question because you have to kind of really be able to hold that shit together.
Oh, yeah.
Just to take a moment, Lennon, the things that he was dismissive of in the moment at any given time, from 1970 to 1980, the fandom, the Beatles fans, took his word initially as the Bible. So we, in our own minds, suppressed and dismissed the things he dismissed. But if you reevaluate for a second, I think Lennon does show up on Pepper in a major way. And I think Good Morning, and Benefit of Mr. Kite and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, they're works of genius.
Big time.
The same way that Paul could toss off genius like Another Day.
Yeah.
The Lennon stuff on Pepper is not to be
dismissed.
Well, it's easy for Lennon to say that Good Morning was a throwaway.
Easy for him.
When you're a genius. When you're a genius.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Who writes that shit? It's absolutely brilliant. As good as anything Ray Davies, his whole shtick.
Oh my God. Yeah.
It must be junk.
But I think you're right. When he would say things like that in interviews over the years, we just go, oh, well, wait a minute. Lennon's saying it's not that great. So should I think it's not that great either? And it influences,
Yeah. I think that's kind of the same way Illustrated Record did. When you take their word for something being shite and yet you carry that with you, it's like, okay, I'm not going to buy this record because they talked about how bad it was. And then maybe at some point you grow up and start to reassess through your adult ears. It's like, wait a minute. They said this was slight. I think just from my perspective of the stuff that I post and people interacting with me, it seems like a lot of people have come around to the Lennon line. Half of what I say is meaningless, where it's just John being John, saying something stupid. Yeah. That's my piece of crap, not Paul's piece of crap or whatever. Things like that. No, it's not. When he says things like that about Andrew Bird Can Sing or Cry Baby Cry, stuff that means a great deal to us as fans, as well as probably to the other Beatles, take that with the massive grain of salt that it warrants.
Well, my first experience with that cognitive dissonance was when I read the Playboy interviews early on as a kid. And I always loved the song. I mean, it's just me. I always loved the song It's Only Love.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I was a personal favorite of mine just because it's so wicked. And he immediately dismissed that one. That's a piece of trash or something. And I was like...
Particular enmity for that song.
Hey, man, I don't agree with you. Yeah, he had particular hatred. And that was like one of my favorites because his vocal's so amazing.
It's got a unique meter to it that he didn't often work with.
Yeah.
And the chord, it's just a track I loved as a kid. God knows why.
You're allowed.
Yeah.
And when he would say that, I would say, God, that really upsets my whole thing.
Right. What do you mean I'm not allowed to like this?
Yeah. And then it would go on. And then that, that was coming from the horse's mouth. And it was, but he would say that also about, like you said, other things like Andrew Bird Can Sing. And a lot of Pepper, he would dismiss Pepper. And that would get into.
Yeah.
And then that hand in hand with the Revolver was never maligned, but Revolver was probably underappreciated in its time, especially by Americans, because we had a different album that was inferior and all this stuff. And so I think there was an overcorrection there to the detriment of Pepper. And I know only nerds like us care about this stuff, but still, that just remains a fact that that's what got this conversation going between me and Pat. Was we were thinking, like, we just, as musicians and fans, just don't understand the vitriol, it's like aimed at Pepper, or just it being perceived as this artificial thing.
I definitely could see where something gets so exalted, so put on a pedestal. It's interesting that Rolling Stone put at the top of the heap for the 500 greatest rock albums of all time, starting in 2003, and then I think they revisited it in 2009, and then suddenly when they did the 2020 list, it's down to 24 or something like that. It got knocked out by What's Going On, Marvin Gaye, and a bunch of other stuff, other Beatle albums included. So lists like that are only snapshots of who's compiling them and the time they're being compiled. Nothing more. They're not worth a damn.
Right.
Right. And the readership they want to appeal to.
Exactly. The demographic. Who are we selling to this month? Oh, okay. We got to get more hip hop in here.
Right.
Yeah, it's stupid. To circle back to the sequencing, though, if you buy into the conceit of a lot of the Pepper songs being the sort of a alternate universe, not necessarily a fully pleasant one or unrealistic one, but all sort of different. I think it's no accident that they sort of circle back to the Pepper reprise where they do.
Oh, yeah.
Like, okay, we're closing the curtain now, but wait. And then there's your major pivot into In a Day in the Life.
But wait, there's more.
Yeah. Oh, wait, there's more. But this is where you're out of that alternate universe and you're back to Earth. And this is like, it is so unbelievably dark. You've got, of course, the heavily echoed Lennon vocal carrying a lot of the song. And I think a lot of the more casual fans will look at like, oh, that's a John song. No, it's not. It's a straight up collaboration. Paula came up with that I'd Love to Turn You On, which is a key thing to it.
Yeah.
And the collaboration between George Martin and Paul for the ascending orchestrated rushes that occur twice in that song. And the Woke Up, which is a very key element to the narrative being put out there. I think it is closely worked on, and both of them being responsible for the end product is anything they ever did. And it carries so much weight because I think it represents, instead of what would be a customary sort of uplift to the end of a musical journey, something happy. You've been on this little trip, and then we're going to leave you, in the vaudevillian theatrical sense with something great and spectacular. It is spectacular, but it's not a feel-good song at all.
No, it's dark. Yeah, that moment, again, the transition between Sgt. Pepper Reprise and Day in the Life.
Yeah.
It's a similar experience as that experience between With and Without You and When I'm 64.
Uh-huh.
There's a world inside the feeling that you get in that transition that I think it's like an existential experience, I think.
Yeah.
If you're really listening and you're really looking at what that feeling is when you switch from between those two things, there's a lot being said just in that feeling,
Where it pivots to that sort of big, grandiose Pepper band closing the show to applause, and then one guy on acoustic guitar,
right,
seemingly in an empty room because there's this echo going on.
Yeah.
And then it gets built up and built up. Ringo's unbelievably magnificent, expressive drums coming in. Did anybody else hear the hook, the I'd Love to Turn You On, as sad? I'd love to turn you on, but I can't.
Yes. It's so funny that you're saying that because just this morning I was making coffee and I put on the Beatles Sirius channel and that song was on.
Oh, wow.
When they got to that moment, because I've sort of been thinking about these ideas that we're talking about, I really heard that line and the sadness in it. Because we've all seen the interviews where Paul's talking about how when they were writing that and they got to that point and they wrote the line, I'd love to turn you on. And John and I looked at each other and we went, do we know what we're doing? And they were like really excited about we're doing this as this moment of excitement.
Yeah.
But you hear the line and it's sad and it's menacing too. It's like almost emotionally menacing in a way.
The way it trails off like that, turn you on. Yeah.
With the chromatic seesaw thing.
It's a little scary.
Yeah.
Right. But that trail off is just genius.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so overlooked that, they'd love to turn us on. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
But it's implicit in, I think, the way it's being delivered is, I would love to, but.
Yeah.
But is not a musical thing to stick in there, so you got to just trail it off. So it's implied.
Yeah. It's like they're acknowledging their own power over the world in a way, because they're kind of like, we've turned you on. We'd love to do more.
Yeah.
We'd love to solve all the problems. We just would love everyone to loosen the fuck up. Of course, that still hasn't happened. If anything, it's gotten worse.
Yeah. And then where it goes, it's like it goes straight to McCartney basically lifting a line from a Great American Songbook song. It's from
yes.
Is it Sunny Side of the Street?
Yes.
Grab your coat and get your hat. Leave your worry on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street.
the grab my coat, grab my hat. That's a straight lift. And that in itself is like a psychedelic moment. It's just like, where?
It's exactly, it's Sunny Side of the Street you would expect from a Paul.
Right.
That stuff would just flow out of him effortlessly.
Right.
But here it is turned on its head.
Yeah.
And he's about to go into a dream after taking his smoke.
This is why Pepper is so powerful and I think so important as showing us like the creative power that they had. Pepper was the moment when they were at their most, I think, like their receptors were so open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Their receptors were just so open at that moment. And their power of reception and their power of transmission were both at their peak.
Yeah.
Because they had the world's ears. They had unlimited access somewhat to EMI and the technology.
They had George Martin.
And George Martin's talents you have to speak about.
Emboldened by a string of hits under a producer that was just, unheard of. So he's riding a high.
Yeah.
Yeah. That facilitated them, that helped nurture them without directing them overtly or stepping in their path.
Yeah.
Just kept pushing them, but drawing the best out of them. That's the unique alchemy of Beatles.
Yeah.
The difference between any solo record by them and what they did with George Martin as a collective.
Yeah.
And can I say the creative quality control that is the elephant in the room of Lennon? That's the thing why you can't listen to anything he says because nobody made a single, they were not comfortable with what was going on till Lennon was approving of it. I'm sorry. But I don't care what the fuck it was, even if it was Maxwell's Silver Hammer. If he didn't get the wink from Lennon, it wasn't happening. I'm just convinced that just as much as you want your older brother, you want the leader to be cool with it. No matter if it was He Will God was Paul's baby. Believe me, Paul wanted Lennon to love everything about it and everything he did. And that's, I think when you get the quality control of Paul and what he was in charge of, and Martin, what he was in charge of, and especially wanting to please Lennon and him, they knew it was hip if Lennon thought it was hip. That just can't be underestimated.
I'm not convinced that the other three had as much disdain for Maxwell as they would claim publicly. I mean, seriously.
Maybe George.
Snippets of...
Yeah, no, as long as you stayed away from his biscuits.
Yeah. Yeah, don't sit on his amp.
Things that John said around the time of Pepper, where he sounds genuinely proud,
Yeah.
He's saying things like, this is the best thing we've ever done. He was there. I mean, it just wasn't until later.
Well, his job is to tear it down. I still believe that even if Paul came up with the high concepts, they moved forward because of John being so restless, never being happy.
Yeah.
The White Album would not have happened. That I do feel that there was something about wanting to please John that drove the Beatles to be so great. I really do. And then, of course, Martin was there to facilitate it, and Paul was there to just provide that drive.
Undeniably, it's a Paul-driven project. Paul and George Martin, they're the ones that are the most energized to be doing this. But in the same spirit that they were all each other's best editors, it probably would have been something else and maybe not as intriguing or deep or dark without the input Lennon brought to the table, even if he wasn't shouldering as big a burden as he had in the past for other records. And he would be the first to say, well, I was inspired by a cornflakes commercial. I was inspired by Julian's painting. I was inspired by what I read in the paper that day. It wasn't his normal stock and trade, either his great gift for wordplay or making universal his own feelings. It was a different sort of palette he was drawing upon for that. But you still had Paul pushing him and teasing the work out from him and fully realizing it. So it is interesting that it's the first undeniably McCartney-driven project that they did as an album. And there's so much other singular aspects about it that it's almost not really fair to judge it alongside other albums.
Right.
Because there's plenty of people that look at it, it's like, well, it's not even the best collection of Beatles songs. If you're quantifying art, maybe that's true, maybe. But if you're looking at it as we're doing this thought experiment, we're doing something different, we're being very deliberate in doing something different than anybody's done before. This is going to be a statement.
Unified, very unified.
Unified, at least at the time they made it. They kind of fell away from it over time.
Yeah.
But to Pat's point, there's some BBC stuff that John did in the run up to it, where he's being very engaged, very energized and excited about what they're doing. The same way there was in early 69, where he's talking about Abbey Road in progress, all excited about the medley they're working on in a way that he would shit all over once Abbey Road was out and Paul was dead.
I think, things like, even if Lennon was dismissive of the fact that he was influenced by a cornflakes commercial and so it's worthless, or influenced by a Victorian poster and it's worthless. It's like, who could take the words from a Victorian circus poster and create a song like that unless you are at the height of your creative genius?
Absolutely.
Well, particularly as a collective, when he comes into the room, just like he gave the directive for Tomorrow Never Knows, I want to be the sound of 40,000 chanting monks or the Dalai Lama on top of a mountain. He comes in with Mr. Kite, I want to smell the sawdust.
Yeah.
That was all he needed. And that's typical Lennon thinking in visual or sensory terms musically, because he didn't have the vocabulary of a McCartney. This is the atmosphere I want to project. This is what I want to see here.
But that's a producer. I want to smell the sawdust. That's something a producer says with his feet up on the console. I want to smell the sawdust. I mean, Lennon was the nuts and bolts of the song are so sound and so constructed as good as any.
Yeah, the bones are there.
Yeah.
Building. It's the height of craft. The bones are the foundation is so sound, and it's a work of genius. Kite is, for my money, I just don't.
Yeah.
Who can write that? Who sees a poster on the wall or a painting by somebody and can just interpret it into a song so you can see it too?
Good morning too. And it's not totally distant from him either. I mean, he's kind of, he's writing about himself. I mean,
it's not literal.
Yeah.
There is some revealing personal stuff in that song. It's not just
Suburban Ennui.
It's not just, exactly. What's his line about when he kind of got onto Paul about songs about boring people doing boring things? He's writing about himself, and it's this magic trick of like talking about this kind of.
Well, he's the biggest hypocrite of all.
This sort of banal suburban ennui, but juxtaposing it against this super swinging, tough rock track that's really exciting.
Yeah.
So it's that tension, it's that juxtaposition.
Yeah.
And it's funny.
It's funny too.
Yeah.
It's very funny because it's like, hey, you boring person. Hey, boring neighborhood. Hey, aren't we all just incredibly stupid and boring? Like, it's kind of that. It's a very funny song. Like, totally swinging.
French had done that one.
Like, hey, mom with the kid,
And it's totally swinging, which is the amazing thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is so much at the heart of why I love Pepper, and I think why it is so deep. It's all those tensions, it's all those juxtapositions, that just that are both exciting and unsettling at the same time.
Yeah, and what about the cover being like? There's no denying that it's some form of a funeral.
Yeah,
right. Like, what's with that?
Yeah, floral arrangements.
Like, even as a kid, I knew one thing as a kid. They're attending something. Do you know what I mean? Like,
well, it's the death of the old Beatles and the birth of this new way. This new approach. It's like
and all of popular culture, by the way, is there at the funeral.
You're right.
Like W.C. Fields and everything.
Right.
It's a way writ large that I think they attempted with Revolver, where again they're going into the studio, throwing away the rule book and everything they know about how to make records. I don't think it is any accident that they echo the Please Please Me album by starting out with that warped countdown into the first track. And maybe that was a little subtle. So the next time they put on the cover, old Beatles facing.
Oh, do you mean on Revolver?
Yeah, Revolver. I think that they were making that statement of this is the new phase, as it were, for the Beatles, because that album totally is the death knell of the Beat group. This is us making much fuller use of the technology and trying to capture what's in our heads on vinyl. Maybe it was a little subtle for people because it didn't get all the attention that year. It was all about being more popular than Jesus. So then they come back the next year. How about this? Is this too subtle for you? There's a grave. That's us as the old guys. Here's us as the new guys.
God, it's so true. That's so true. Yeah, and it's the first album they didn't have to do.
Mm-hmm.
There was no directive. You got to make it was like, they stopped touring. They could have all collectively said, fuck it. At that point, Epstein, I don't know if he had any control over that. It almost seemed like, let's just do one more.
They'd signed that new contract in 67 to redress this ridiculous contract they signed in 62. But by that time, they'd already signaled, hey, we're going forward. Screw the touring bit, but By November, they're starting on something grandiose and ambitious. And so even though the public, it took a while because they blew past that stop sign of having product out in December of 66. So
There you go.
they had to put
Yeah.
that oldies collection out in England and nothing in America. Once January came and they got that initial single out there with beautiful promo films to go with it, I think the world's like, okay, you're still in business. That's great. Take all the time you need. While you're being left to wonder from January till May, what's that hammering going on in my neighbor's garage all hours? What are they up to?
Right.
You know, when George Martin has that, he said, "Oh, I always regretted snatching Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane off the record." What do you make of that? Because I could see Penny Lane on the record. Strawberry Fields Forever to me just stands alone. Like, I get that's the catalyst for the new way of thinking and the new way of being in the studio, but
Yeah.
what was that? You know, because to me, it's like a gateway single.
It absolutely serves that purpose of putting the public on notice that this is our new direction. This is our jazz odyssey. But
Well, my dad told me, I remember once asking, like, what do you remember when you first heard Strawberry Fields? You know, and he said, "Oh, I came on the radio and had to pull over."
him and Brian Wilson.
And that's echoes a lot what a lot of people. Dylan said that about hearing that, you know, "I Want to Hold Your Hand." So
Yeah.
there's definitely a second act thing going on here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You know, with us Beatle fans, you get asked the question, what's your favorite Beatles album? And, you know, for so long, you know, I probably have said Revolver more than anything else in my lifetime, but there are times when I say Pepper. You know, how do you even do that? I hate even thinking along those terms.
Yeah.
I've started to answer that question by saying my favorite Beatles album is the Strawberry Fields Penny Lane single. You know, it's kind of
hard to go wrong there.
Kind of gets me out of that trouble. But I do kind of feel that way in a lot of ways.
I thought that was on Magical Mystery Tour. Right?
Yeah. But yeah, I think George Martin was just so proud. I think he was just so proud of that time of the work that they did. And obviously deeply proud of Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, that he probably just wanted it all to live together in this package that could sort of represent that period and the way he was working with them in that period, because that really was probably where he felt like his gifts and their gifts were the most copacetic and at their peak power.
Yeah.
But they weren't supposed to be on Pepper. Pepper would not have been Pepper with those songs.
Yeah, or just regretting that he probably looked in retrospect like, you know, I kind of had the power to do what I wanted. I kept towing the company line, like, let's get something out, da-da-da-da-da.
Right.
But that was probably more about himself.
He's the same guy that said the White Album should have been a single disc.
That's true.
Enough said.
Forget him.
What was the date of the release of Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane?
I want to say late February.
So it came out while they were working on Pepper, yeah. If those had been on Pepper, I wonder what would have not been on Pepper. So,
oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you feel the vibe. That same mystical, magical thing is going on in Penny Lane. I think that solidified their approach, you know, on that single. Aren't they cutting one on 64 during that and stuff anyways? Yeah,
they'd started that one right after Strawberry Fields, but then pivoted to Penny Lane once Paul came in with that, and that became the single. One on 64 wouldn't have worked as the flip to Strawberry Fields at all. I mean, you had this great monumental double A side thing once you got Penny Lane involved.
Jeez.
I always thought it would be amazing if they did like a package calling it 1967 where you put together Pepper, Mystery Tour, It's All Too Much, all that stuff from that year. You could program it however you like, but that would be quite a trip. Even throw in
Christmas Time is here again.
There you go. What's Carnival of Lights?
Yeah. And Christmas Time is here. Oh, it is just mind-blowing when you look at the schedule. When you look at the dates, it wasn't that long after they finished Pepper before they were recording the Magical Mystery Tour track. Wasn't it like a week?
It was April.
It wasn't like a week later or something. It's like
it was right away. And You Know My Name, they started early on.
That's just unbelievable. It's like, well, we've taken a week off, guys. We just made a masterpiece, so I'm ready to get back to it. That is just, that's unbelievable.
Screams of McCartney.
Well, that's what plays into Lennon's revisionism and stuff, or just regrets and all that, is that I don't think he was allowed to think about what he was doing until it was over.
Right.
And so once it was over, he was just trying to make sense of it probably in his head. And I don't remember liking that. And I do remember liking that. And fuck that. And plus he was kind of bitter and pissed off. So, But at the time, contemporaneously, I don't think any of them formulated a single opinion really about what they were doing.
That's a really good point, because they were moving so fast,
So fast.
They were just moving so fast that I think you're right. He probably just didn't even have time to process his emotions about what they were doing.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Well, nor Epstein's death.
I know.
Nothing traumatic even, except for in song. All they could do was just sing something. And you got to wonder how much of Epstein's death. It's kind of interesting that they do, Pep. They have this magic, this 1967 that you're talking about, which is of a piece, even musically. And my God, Epstein goes out. Epstein actually goes out.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like it is this pinnacle,
I think the last song he got to hear was Your Mother Should Know, as far as new material goes.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And it's like, where did those feelings go? Where did those feelings of loss go in their music? They were working so fast, working so much. Where did they process it? And it must have gone into the music somewhere, so where is it?
Hello, Goodbye.
Hello, Goodbye. And doesn't Yoko come in at that exact moment right before Epstein dies?
They meet right after he comes back from working on How I Won the War. So that's the famous Indica meeting, but she's kind of this background sort of nutcase stalking figure.
That session.
No, when she first comes in the studio, it was at the Fool on the Hill session in September. So it was like a fortnight after the firewall was gone.
There you go. Yeah. A fortnight after the firewall. There's your next book. But that's so true. And in a way, she becomes the new firewall, but it's just around Lennon.
Yeah. Pop Psychology 101. You ask where he processes it. Paul, just like when his mother died, just puts it all into work. We're going to go to India in September. Let's get this film done now. Let's just push and get this thing done. So they go off on that for the rest of the year, basically. Defer India till early the next year. John goes along with that. TM, Maharishi's his new father figure, goes there, becomes disenchanted due to Magic Alex putting this shit in his ear about the Maharishi, leaves in a huff. That's when he has his breakdown. That's when he comes back, goes on an acid bender, declares he's Jesus Christ returned to earth. And then Yoko enters the scene and boom, it's extreme coupleness from that point on.
Well, people try to pinpoint the crack between Lennon and McCartney, and a lot of people have pinpointed it to Rishikesh. And it could not be a specific thing. It could just be the perfect storm of everything going on there.
I think that the loss of Brian had a lot.
The disenchantment with Maharishi.
Yeah, had a lot to do with affecting John. And I think there was the sort of Band-Aid in between was TM and the Maharishi until it wasn't. The pattern of disenchantment with the next father figure. Brian had been it for a long time. And then later on, Janoff would be it.
But McCartney, in a way, that's where I think the disagreement on part of Lennon comes in right there, because who's he left looking at? It's like right there, in a sense, the next quote unquote father figure is what shouldn't be, which is his partner, McCartney. He's looking at him, and anyone would become resentful because McCartney's kind of leading the charge of some sort.
Well, in the void created by Lennon checking out, it's not like he was usurping the king and knocking him off the throne.
No.
The king took himself off the throne.
Absolutely.
He's basically an acid casualty for a lot of 67. They pushed TM as a way to wean him out of that.
Yeah.
And it works for a time until it doesn't.
Sure.
And then that one last acid bender that we know about latches onto Yoko. Next thing he's on heroin.
And Pepper's a distant memory.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's not a pleasant memory at that point.
Right.
It's a source of irritation when brought up.
That is so true. Jesus.
That is a big, rich area, the dynamic between John and Paul. If you get to it beyond analyzing lyrics, but to whatever extent there's any data to be mined from stuff that's out there, you need somebody with a deep knowledge of psychology and addiction issues to probably do it justice. But the story to be told there, it hasn't been told for sure.
Just to bring it back to Pepper, I think that again is part of the magic of it, and maybe part of the deep love for the record, is that there is a lot of the relationship between John and Paul still intact in that record that we don't get after that,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there's a creative magic between them, although their individual voices are very strong.
You're saying they're still kind of welded during that record.
United in purpose.
Yes. Yeah. And just like you see it in those photographs that I was looking back through from the sessions where you can see it, you feel it in the album, you hear it. that's the magic. It's Day in the Life. It's John's emotional presence, that depth that you feel in that first verse of Day in a Life, where it just stops you in your tracks.
Yeah.
You take that ride with him to Paul appearing in the middle.
Not to dismiss Ringo and George, but they really were each other's safe space. They enabled each other the same way Paul was there when John was doing Julia and that kind of stuff. But that was much more welded and intertwined in Pepper. Pepper, in a way, is really the proper ending of the Beatles. And you kind of get this bonus gift of the other 3 albums or 4 albums. You get this, like, sure, why not? Let's do it. We're here. but George is already disenchanted and all this, and Ringo's, starting to, everyone's kind of getting into the craziness of the 60s. But if you end with Day in the Life, you could reliably, you know what I mean? You just be like, okay, fine, put a nail in it.
Right. What's different is the individuality asserting itself, whereas before it was this four-headed monster, single-mindedness that had carried the career to that point. I would say there's probably a little bit of erosion with that between Revolver and Pepper, because you have George then stepping back. The lead guitarist is suddenly delegating his main job or writing his songs on keyboard that year. And, Ringo's learning how to play chess, and Paul leading the charge with John joined at the shoulder with him to create art. As he said, like a year before in More Popular Than Jesus interview, John goes, whatever I was meant to do, this isn't it. And what he was referring to is Beatlemania as usual to that point. So then he dabbles in filmmaking to see if that's what he's meant to do, decides that's not for him. Oh, we're going to do something conceptual in the studio that we don't have to play live. Okay, I'm there. Sign me up. And so Paul was ready, leading the charge. He's come up with a concept. And I don't know where that whole thing came from that George Martin talked about, that initially they were going to do some kind of musical statement on their childhoods in Liverpool. Is that something he extrapolated from Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, or was that an actual concept in progress till they decided it wasn't for Pepper? I don't know.
Probably that's probably the more likely scenario, is that vaguely that's what they would do until Paul had this was on a plane and looked at
the salt and pepper,
a salt and pepper shaker. But I think you just hit on something, which if there's a knock against Pepper, it's got to be not just the lack of George's personality there, but also even when he tried to have personality on the record, like they took those other songs off or Only a Northern Song, he's a bit diminished on that record. Let's face it.
Yeah. That is the big sort of kind of sadness about it, is that George isn't, but he's got some great guitar moments on the record.
Yeah.
And that magnum opus with Within and Without You, which even John praised.
So intense. Yeah.
And just that in itself, I mean, that is just so intense and so big.
Yeah.
That's kind of, and is such an important presence on the album.
It is interesting when you contrast Abbey Road and Let It Be. With Let It Be, they set the parameters. This is going to be an honest record, no overdubs, no cheating, none of your production bullshit, George Martin. It's going to be us playing live as a band. And so necessarily, it's a lot more hands-on group involvement. You've got a lot of the group harmonies again throughout that and throughout the Rooftop and all that stuff, in a way that Abbey Road, in the mind of at least Paul and George Martin, was a return to a Sgt. Pepper style record where there was a certain ambition to it and crafting the side 2 suite, and that you're going to let me produce again, right, boys? That George Martin dictated. And it is them, whether consciously or not, thinking this could be the end of the road, all sort of stepping up and being cooperative in a way that maybe they hadn't for a while. When I listen to it and then come to recognize that, you know what? Where there should be more group harmonies, there's not. There's a lot of Paul singing with himself, or Paul and George, not John. Yeah. And that to me makes me a little bit sad. It's like, if we could have had all the voices of all 4 Beatles, or at least 3 of them, how much more cohesive and Beatley this might have been. But maybe that's just me being a nitpicky fan. It's just an interesting that was the decision made. And we know the bullshit story that Jeff Emmerich tells of John did all the vocals on Come Together, and Paul himself saying, I was too embarrassed to ask if I could sing a harmony, when we know from the stems, yes, you did. There it is. I knew, Rock Band wasn't going to come along, but I don't know.
Oh, yeah. It's undeniably Paul, yeah.
Paul will do some rewriting of history when given the chance.
He does. He does.
Part half of
They
it's
all do.
age, you know. I mean, these guys are so damn old now. I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
we should just be grateful they're around and they can remember anything. But there was a point at which you did start to get diminishing returns with Paul.
Well, it's job security for us.
It is definitely. Yeah, right. Exactly.
Pick over this stuff and dig deep and tell them how it was.
Absolutely.
I came across something on YouTube last week that was a CBS News program called 48 Hours.
Right.
And it was from 1990.
Oh, yeah.
They were following Paul around during the Flowers in the Dirt tour. It's a long segment, and there's a moment where the journalist sits with Paul, and there's a pretty in-depth interview, and he basically asks him to tell in a nutshell the story of the breakup. And Paul starts to talk about the tension in the White Album period, but then he kind of stops himself and he goes, well, actually during Pepper is really when things started to change a bit.
Interesting.
He says George just stopped showing up for the sessions.
There you go.
Which was kind of odd because nobody had ever just not shown up for the sessions.
That is really interesting.
The breakup, how did it happen?
We'd been together like 10 years, and during the making of the White Album, things started to get a little bit edgy. In fact, during the making of Sgt. Pepper, George hadn't showed for most of the album, which was unusual, because we normally showed for our recording sessions. George hasn't been too interested in making that album. I think he was building a swimming pool. And it was just all a little bit like that. And of course, I was sort of thinking, thought, well, I won't say anything, but it's a bit dodgy. We went on to make the White Album, and things really did start to kind of disintegrate a little bit. And eventually, when Alan Klein came in, I think he was the final straw. He got a meeting with John and Yoko the night before we were due to have a big sort of State of the Nation meeting. And John and Yoko arrived the next day, and John issued a statement saying, all my affairs are now in the hands of Alan Klein. Everything I do must go through him. And we were due to sign a deal with Capitol Records, which was what we were all there for, this meeting. And Klein apparently had said to John, look, don't say anything. John had expressed his desire to, leave the group. And Klein, being a businessman, had said, don't say anything till after they've signed the new Capitol deal, which he was involved with. I'd been arguing for weeks about his percentage and stuff. I figured we were a big act. We could give him 15%. The others were saying, no, he's got to have 20. I said, we're a big act, guys. Real big group. He'll take 15. Don't you worry. They said, no way. Anyway, so John was at that meeting, and he just suddenly let it out. He just looked at us all. We were sitting around like this, and John just said, I wasn't going to tell you till after you signed the Capitol deal. He said, but I'm leaving the group. And he just looked at us, and our jaws just fell, and we all went kind of white. And he said, it's kind of a great feeling, telling you. It's kind of an adrenaline rush. He said, it's like, telling someone you're getting divorced. He said, it's kind of, a little bit weird, but I'm leaving the group.
Well, it's interesting that he seems to be recalling the fact that he had to handle some of the lead guitar chores during that period, but I'm not aware of George not showing up.
Yeah.
As much as he was in a different headspace after going to India.
Well, maybe he meant showing up.
Being fully engaged. Well, he certainly wasn't the George of Revolver who ends up getting the lead-off track and
oh my God,
3 songs on a single record. He never ever reached that ratio again.
There was a certain tinge of hurt in the way Paul was kind of telling the story. It kind of seemed like kind of what you were saying earlier, Luther, that maybe Pepper in a way is sort of like the ending, and then we got extra stuff after.
Yeah,
sure.
But that was the kind of the moment where it was obviously the great change,
Yeah, 67 definitely broke the Beatles. There's no doubt about it. It's the great heights and the great come down of it all. Between the death of Epstein and between the death of touring and the death of the ego with all the drugs, the LSD use. And I think it was a big death. And to your point, Pat, that's so intrinsic in the record. It's so there.
Right.
Very much. Yeah.
The funeral is on the cover.
Yeah.
Right.
It's death and rebirth, and it's entertainment and art. It's joy and existential dread. All of that stuff is sort of happening at the same time in Pepper.
It's the Beatles' Bloody Pepper. Shut up.
I think, exactly. I could talk about it all day.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a reason, because again, there's so many reasons to appreciate it, especially from our perspective, which is we're both of a certain age and musicians. But I shared that with all my friends, and I growing up in it cut across generational lines. And I think this conversation is also about just gently reminding that the nuts and bolts of the thing were very sound. And there's a reason that it resonated. It's really strong stuff. Don't try to make it out to be this piffle. It's not. It's probably is what you think it is and what people say it is. It's all I'm trying to say. It's a masterpiece. It's the greatest album of 20. Yeah, it is. If you think of the 20, well, when people look back and there's history books about the 20th century, they're always going to bring it up.
As a sociological event, as an event in art and what it influenced.
Yeah.
Yeah. One united an American audience, one united the world the moment it had dropped, the moment it happened. And you can't deny that or take that away from them. As far as lasting effect, there were some people said, well, what did it influence that was of lasting in terms of the direction music went? It seemed like a lot of where rock went was a reaction to Pepper, which was going into 68, stripping back, going back to basics, back to roots, as exemplified by the Band or Creedence. It wasn't like everybody was building on Pepper. Some people did their own little pretentious album-late statements. Yeah, to varying degrees, but...
version of Sgt. Pepper. Yeah.
Other people just either recognize, well, they've taken it as far as you can go in that direction. Now let's go in this direction.
But it did infuse the music scene with the sense of ambition and scope that they otherwise wouldn't have had. Like,
well, the currency from the hit single to the album length statement, for sure, right?
Right.
A commercial prospect to get wild. And that's never a bad thing for the radio, for creativity. Yeah. I mean, I do believe it, we're still in the ripples of that because everything is accepted because of that. Oh, that's Wilco's Pepper, or
to say we can go for it. Like you can just go for it.
That's it right there.
And that it is both high art and entertainment at the same time.
Yeah, pop.
The album is sort of like wrestling with that. Like, are we entertainers? Are we art? Or is it a big vaudevillian
taking the piss.
Show and let's make everybody happy? Or is it like, let's go to some like dark existential musings?
Yeah.
It's both things at the same time, and it can be, and you're allowed to do both things at the same time.
Definitely.
And there's your tension again.
Definitely.
That makes everything so compelling.
No doubt about it. And then, of course, there's just the personal interior level of it, which when the box set came out and they did the remix of it and they had all those outtakes, I got invited to Capitol. A friend invited me to have a listen where Giles spoke a bit and then presented the new mix of Pepper. And they wheeled out these big speakers and there was an audience. What was amazing was, okay, we're all going to sit down and listen to Pepper.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's going to be quiet and listen to this record play for. And that's when I first realized there was a little rub for me because I realized it was a much more interior album than I had remembered it being. It's not that I didn't enjoy it, but I almost got this kind of, I didn't anticipate it, but I got a slight annoyance of like, I'll understand this album in more ways than to myself. I don't need to listen to this with anybody because all of a sudden I've realized, oh my God, this is a very interior album.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a communal thing for you?
No, it wasn't a communal thing for me. It was a completely personal experience that I did not associate with sitting around and grooving with a bunch of people. Like, I know some people did, but I don't know if that was our generation's experience of Pepper.
Yeah, that's interesting because Paul is known for hey, let's put on a show. Let's invite everybody in. That's his whole thing. That inclusivity is like his thing. And I would associate that sort of insular, I need to experience this on my own with something Lennon does. Everybody draws their own personal meaning from it.
Right.
Rather than this thing that was meant to be broad and inviting. So that's a really interesting take on that.
Yeah, it was a headphone album at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what started this conversation the other day between Luther and I. It's like, that's why it's an unfair assessment of the album, that it lacks emotional depth, or that it's not about personal expression, that it's just a superficial,
surfacey. Yeah.
And it's like I say, are you listening to the same album? I think if you're actually listening to the album, then you're having that experience, Luther, that you're describing.
Yeah, and I'm just too tied up in it emotionally. I'm just too tied up in it to even understand it that way.
Yeah.
Like, I can't put it any other way. Like, when you've listened to something since before you could talk, and when you've interpreted all things through the lens of something in an interior way, it's sort of like people could say all they want, but I'm not capable of hearing it the same way. I'm capable of understanding as a way that I took to go inside myself.
There is emotional depth and there is personal expression in the record, but it's a more nuanced, what's the word? It's numinous, it's like.
Right.
It's communicating in a way that it's beyond language. It's beyond rational analysis, It's
absolutely. Yeah. And that's not a high or low thing. That's not a high.
Right.
We're not talking, this isn't snobbery. This is just literally like, I was taught things by it, and with a little help from my friends, and I learned who the Beatles were through it. Therefore, cooperation, therefore, harmony, therefore, like you're saying, darkness, sadness, light, all this stuff. When She's Leaving Home would come on, I'd feel that tug. The strings for me gave me an emotional tug that when they get to the chorus and it kind of rides one chord, we da 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 da, but it's all still just right. And then when it turns right there, that's a musical emotional lesson on how you can, excuse the pun, but you can pull people's strings musically, and it all makes sense. At that point, you're going down the slide. You're on the emotional ride of this song, and it's heavy. You carry it with you the rest of your life. I mean, it's hard to describe in words.
I think it really is, with all due respect to the master, George Martin, it is the perfect string arrangement for that song. It is.
Absolutely.
It would not do what it does if it didn't have that arrangement.
I was shocked when I found out it wasn't Martin. I mean, when I was younger, I couldn't believe it. Was it Leander? Or?
Mike Leander, yeah.
Yeah. It's a melodrama,
Totally.
And it needs that kind of treatment, I think, to put you in that mind frame, to go there emotionally. It says, you know what? It's okay for you to be emotional about this story, about this situation. If it was approached with too much distance, or if it was starker, it wouldn't give you the permission to...
You're saying if it was approached as a for no one type of arrangement,
I think so.
Something starker. And so, yeah, I totally know what you mean.
Yeah.
It has more scope and more, it's a little syrupier, but it's really on point.
It's on point.
That arrangement.
Yeah. I think it gives you the permission to go there emotionally.
And then Lennon being there with them, leaning over his shoulder musically, answering with that Greek chorus thing you're talking about, Robert. It's like, there's such a beauty of cooperation there. Yeah. It's like they're just showing by example the way humans can be. And I think I took that as a kid. I was like, okay, it can be like this. I'm so glad I got off on that foot as a person, knowing people could support each other like that. And that's what I get from Lennon McCartney. Just the fact that Lennon is there. And maybe Paul's baby, but he's leaning over his shoulder and saying, hey, listen to what my mate has to fucking say.
Yeah.
Yeah, you notice
a beautiful thing.
There's a few of those instances on side one where it's sort of this call and response thing. It can't get no worse. Or
yes,
what do you see when you turn out the light? Where you've got two different speakers responding to each other. I love that.
It's support.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's real support. And that's the thing you get from the Beatles. There's the takeaway. It's just that camaraderie and cooperation. You feel like that's something you want to teach. It's something you want to carry with you. It's just something you want to kind of spread, It's like just a beautiful thing. And it's that same, I'd love to turn you on. That's where the sadness is in that line, because you would love everyone to be turned on to that sense of camaraderie and that magic and stuff,
I would argue that they did, at least as far back as the Sullivan Show, when they projected what you can achieve through friendship.
You're right.
With your little gang, that egalitarianness of look at the fun we're having. It's me and my friends. They inspired 1 million groups to start overnight, and whatever they did in England on the same scale before that. I think that is a huge thing. I mean, arguably, Lonnie Donegan in kicking off Skiffle there, you don't need talent. You don't need an instrument. Go get that found object in your house and start banging on it.
Yeah, that's punk rock. That's punk.
Very, very. That's the commonality there. So I think whatever sadness they're feeling about wanting to turn you on, which is probably, if it had any meaning at that moment of anything specific, was higher consciousness. I would love to turn you on. It might be impossible. It's too big a job for us. But luckily, here comes Sexy Sadie to spread the word.
No, I think that's George, and maybe that's George Harrison's contribution. We've learned in retrospect, he's like a junior Lennon. I mean, there was a quality control there too, when it comes to the spiritual side of things.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's just so damn well rounded about those guys. That's what continues to fascinate us, is it all fits together like some beautiful, some beautiful, these gears, of a beautiful clock or something.
Everything enhances everything else.
It really does.
It makes it stronger.
Yeah. And all we're saying is, give a chance, man.
Give Pepper a chance, man.
Give Pep a chance.
Give Pepper a chance.
Pep a chance. Between the fact it was this major phenomenon that no one doesn't know about, all the way down to the most minute, glorious detail.
How it moves people. The feeling you get from listening to that stuff and what it makes you, if somebody says the word Beatles or puts an image in front of you, it really is a secular religion. It just cuts across absolutely everything. And the way it makes you look at the world, the way it makes you interact with other people, it's such a powerful, powerful thing that I don't know if they ever realized the full depth of what they set in motion.
Well, I think that's kind of what I was saying before. And certainly this period, I mean, their entire career and just them as artists and, their whole lives. But when you look at this period, this like 66, 67 period, and you just see what they achieved and what came out of that period, you just see these four young guys, these four young artists whose power of reception and power of transmission were just so intensely powerful at that moment. It's just magic. It's just magic. The fact that they were as open as they were to taking in influence and synthesizing it into something that was both deeply personal and obviously universal and lasting. Yeah. It's just nothing short of a miracle.
No doubt about it.
Yeah, yeah. This feedback loop between artist and audience.
Yeah. Yeah, conduits.
It's interesting seeing how people interpret it. Like Pat and I have been doing music a long time. And then there's a whole way that you relate in music. The way that you opened up to music. Personally, I learned the chords when I started playing guitar was that, I don't know if it had to do with the series, but it was called The Complete Beatles, the books.
Yeah, right.
But the chords, I mean, it also says complete, I think, with EAT. Maybe I'm...
Yeah, the little slipcase thing.
Yeah, the slipcase thing. And that's how I learned my guitar chords. Because
me too. Same here.
You too? Same. Okay.
Same here.
Cool.
And I think the reason it worked was because it's a little different when someone just shows you guitar chords, like, oh, that's nice, it's a G. There's no context. With the Beatles, I knew all the songs, so I knew why they were going from G minor back to D major. I could start to get my head wrapped around it because...
It taught you the theory.
It taught me the theory because I understood the songs already and what they were doing, like I knew the material. So...
Yeah, and now you had the roadmap.
Now I had the roadmap at 14 when I learned, like even She's Leaving Home, that's what it reminds me of. When I think of that song, there was a guitar interpretation in those books of that song where you're in E and then you hit a certain open chord that's like a B. It's a weird one. To this day, I'll never forget when I heard that essentially going from E major to B minor is what it's essentially doing. Mm-hmm. I could understand that change and what it meant emotionally in that song by going, oh shit, that's what they're doing. It's like I zeroed right in on it. There were a few things that I wanted to figure out, like that weird chord in I Want to Tell You, where it does that weird, because my grandmother was over at the house one day and perversely, I made her play that for me because she could play piano. And I was just like, not only do I want to know what this is, but I want to see what she thinks. And she got to it, sure enough, and I was just like, I didn't know if I was half like making her do something she wouldn't want to do, or I probably also put Black Sabbath sheet music in front of her too. But point being that when you can see it in action, see it in motion, you start relating to the Beatles in a different way as a musician. Musically, when you start getting inside of how they did that stuff and
the craftsmanship of it,
and then the poetry. You'd see the words there and how it goes with it. I couldn't really read music. I could just figure out the chords.
That it's not just magic, it's also work. But the fact that the work and the magic exist at the exact same time is, again, that's the power.
That's the power. And that's another reason I have a hard time with the criticisms that I constantly hear about Pepper. It's surface and it's this and that. It's like, Okay, but do you understand how much work it took to get to the point of making Pepper and then to actually execute Pepper? This is the best we got in 1967. This is the pinnacle. After armloads of hits under our arms and the gold wire technology and EMI, you can't get any better. Sometimes I want people to understand the craftsmanship, and it's just not done with mirrors at all. Yeah. It's really for real.
Tons of it.
The end.
All right.
No.
I could talk about this all day. There's just so much joy in listening back to this music, and just continuing to participate in it, It's just consistently rewarding.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're a record maker like myself, I produce records, I mix records, record making is such a central part of my life. There's no way that you can enter into that process without thinking about not only Sgt. Pepper, but, everything the Beatles did, but certainly Revolver and Pepper, it's almost become a verb at this point. It's like, are we going to Sgt. Pepper this? Are we going to pepper this? Or, are we, it's like, it's an approach. It's a mindset. It's that mind,
right.
That mindset
Shorthand.
of like, are we just going to go for it here and not worry about whether or not we can pull this off on stage?
Right.
That's almost become a verb, peppering it,
Yeah. And I have to think that the appreciation for what they did must be so profound for people like yourself, recognizing that what they created in comparison to what can be done now is like with one hand tied behind your back. The palette that they had, the limitations. And as we know, limitations will stir creativity because then you have to innovate. You have to do all these workarounds. They did what they did with a fraction of what people are capable of utilizing now. That in a way, it made their job easier because now when you've got so much choice, so many tools at your disposal, it's almost like you become paralyzed. It's like, well, where do I start?
Oh, yeah.
They had this little limited palette to begin with that they were able to expand upon and fully utilize, and with exactly the right people working with them. So they were lucky in that sense that success gave them that carte blanche in a way that other artists didn't have to spend their endless hours in the studio.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. There's so much talk about how Pepper took so long to make and that, but then you really look at it and you're like, I've spent way longer on a mix of a song. It's like, yeah. Lucy in the Sky took 4 days to record. I'm like, do you understand? Like, I've spent 4 months on things, that.
Yeah, it's like that Ruddles line. The first album was recorded in a day. The second one took even longer.
That's great.
That's so true. That's amazing. Man.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by The Corgis.